Hey, it's Matthew Todd and welcome to the next lesson in Module 4. In the first lesson, we talked about some of the reasons TDD can seem hard or intimidating to many. And then in the last lesson, we discussed different levels of testing, some traits of the tests that different levels have. We looked at the standard ice cream cone anti-pattern, and then the test pyramid, to talk about the likely balance of tests that we should aim for. But how do we decide what tests we should have at each level? Well, if we start at the bottom and aim for a large number of unit tests, then most of our test effort is going to be focused on unit tests, ideally using testing for purpose as a strategy for structuring those tests. And there are some things that we might not want to test at the unit test level though, such as where we have classes that are really just data structures. If using testing for purpose, this actually becomes obvious, because for classes like this, there is no real behaviour to verify if we were to attempt to test those in isolation. So if unit tests are verifying our application behaviour in a large number of small, very precisely focused tests, then what are the tests above this actually verifying? So in my mind, as you move up the pyramid, your test should only be verifying something which cannot already be verified by a test beneath it in the pyramid. We want to avoid any kind of test duplication, especially as there's a higher cost associated with tests towards the top as we discussed before. And this is something a lot of people don't actually get. I see most development teams make this kind of mistake. For example, I've seen a large number of projects that look like this. There'll be a web application that sits in front of an API, where there are some services and obviously code sitting behind those services. And taking a feature, for example input validation, so returning an error message if the user doesn't fill out all the fields in a form or provides invalid data. And at the low level, there'll be unit tests testing the validation is being performed as expected. So making sure that with the various different types of bad input that there could be, an appropriate error message is generated. So it could be via return value exception, whatever your strategy for that is. And at the API level, they'll want to make sure that these error details are surfaced to the API client. At the front end, they'll also want to make sure that the error details are displayed to the user, so they can correct their input and continue. But time and time again, I see that when testing each layer, there's a lot of duplication. So when it comes to automated testing of the front end, rather than simply verifying the error delivery mechanism, that is verifying when an error is returned via the API, it can be displayed. But rather than just doing this, the person writing these tests will typically want to cover all conditions, all types of validation failures that can occur. This makes them feel safe and confident in the system, but there's a massive amount of duplication here. So we're using a form of tests that are more time-consuming to run, harder and more time-consuming to debug, and we're using these tests to verify behaviour that's already been verified by the very small focused unit tests that are orders of magnitude quicker to develop, execute, and debug. And when these tests do fail, assuming the unit tests for this behaviour all pass, you're just going to get a large number of failures, essentially telling you the same thing, that the mechanism for displaying these errors is broken. And the reasons for this duplication vary. It can be seeking a false sense of increased confidence, but it really comes down to one thing, which is the team as a whole or the person writing these higher level tests is not really understanding what behaviour we're already verifying at the lower level, and therefore not understanding what the gap in this testing is, what isn't covered. In this case, it's just the error delivery mechanism that should be tested at the higher level, as we said before. So as we move up this pyramid, seek to only test things that haven't been tested by the lower levels. So this is going to be testing things like the interaction between components, verifying these contracts and assumptions we've made about how our different components, services talk to each other and how they react to different responses, and ensuring that if someone does break that implied contract between the different components, then we should get a test failure. So as we go up the pyramid, where we involve more of the system, there should actually be far less functionality covered, only testing the things we can't test lower down, the interactions between those components. The things that are impossible to test lower down, where for your specific system you need to verify particular interactions with external systems maybe, types of data stores for example. And this becomes much more about verifying the mechanics of the way the things in your system communicate, rather than any functionality or business logic. If this sounds complex, don't worry, I'll give you some examples of this in the next lesson, and show you some ways you can get consistency in your test approach that you take. But for now, just think about the rule of avoiding duplication. For every test that you write, ask yourself whether you're verifying something that's already been verified in a test lower down the pyramid. And maybe the test action is still valid, but you just need to remove some of the assertions from your test. So keep that test focused on just the things that you've not already been verifying. So I'll leave it here for now, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson, where I introduce test statements, and I'll show how they can make your test approach consistent and valuable.